This lecture is pertaining to grief. Now, first of all, we all grieve. There's constant things that we get upset about, and many times we don't think of these as grief situations. But we need to realize that grief happens, okay? Now, grief occurs whenever there's a loss, whenever there's an unmet expectation, or whenever there's a disappointment. Also, you can have minor grief issues, moderate grief issues, or major grief issues. Now, you can be grieving more than one grief issue at a time as well, so they can actually pancake. Now, one of the things that I wanted to discuss with you is when you have a grief event, and let's say that it's a major grief event, there's going to be a tremendous emotional response, okay? Now, about 3 months later, the person will be, come along and they'll think, oh, wow, so-and-so's been gone now for 3 months. Wow, and they'll have a little bit, they'll have an uptick on their emotionality. And then around 6 months, they will have another remembrance and thought about, oh my goodness, that happened 6 months ago. And the same thing will happen at 9 months. But let's go back and talk about the initial event. Now, if we're talking about a major grief event, and this can apply to any grief, any episode of grieving, but particularly in major grief events, there's going to be a real emotional response. Now, let's talk about, let's take for example what happened in our neighborhood several years ago. I had a friend of mine that was our next door neighbor, and he was a cop. Incredible cop. Incredible father. Incredible husband. He was a state cop. And in 1990, no, it was the year 2000, we had an ice storm. And that ice storm, it shut down the state, put a tremendous amount of ice on the roads. And he was a captain for the state police, and his secretary called and said she was having trouble getting to the headquarters, and so he said, don't worry about it, I'm on my way, I'll man the office. And so on his way, he witnessed an accident, and he pulled over to help. And he kind of got some things under control and called for wrecker and called for assistance and such. And then an oncoming car lost control, hit the bridge, and ricocheted into him, who was off the road. He was off to the side of the road, and yet it ricocheted into him and hit him, and he went flying. And that morning before 8 o'clock, my neighbor came and knocked on our door and told us that Tom was dead. I was devastated. I was shocked. I was stunned. And as I looked over, well, actually he lived across the street, not next door. As I looked across the street, I already saw state police vehicles. And I started seeing neighbors pouring into Tom's house. and there were cops there at the front door. There were neighbors coming in. The pastor of her church, he came. People from her study group, they came. Neighbors were going into their house, and one neighbor said, I'm going to clean the house for her. Another one answered the phone. Another took care of her schedule. All these things were happening at that house. The chaplain came from the state police, met with her. Then she had all this support, and they had so many people call with love, and the person that was keeping a schedule, they actually had meals that were pledged for 3 months. Incredible outpouring. Well, that's the way it happens when you have this initial event. Everybody is stunned. Everybody wants to help. You feel really helpless. You want to do something. Let me do something. Let me help. Let me clean your house. Let me bring you over some food, something, because everybody feels helpless and they want to contribute something to ease the pain. Well, at 3 months, most people have started moving on, but they remember. At 6 months, oh my goodness, it's been 6 months since Tom's gone. 9 months goes by, but here's the kicker. At a year, at the year's anniversary, the emotional spike hits the same level as it did on the day it happened. Now, the difference is, here, they have all those people coming in. They have all those people. What can I do to help? How can I pray with you? What do you need? Let me watch the phones for you. Let me just be here in case you need something. Here, they have the exact same emotional needs, but the support system is not there. If you don't get anything else out of this lecture, please remember that when a person has a major loss, 1 year later, they need to have support. And they need for people to remember and to call up and say, I know that you lost so-and-so at this time, and if I'm thinking about him and I'm hurting, I know that this must be a very, very painful time for you. And offer to take them out, offer to buy them coffee, offer to come over and just talk with them and sit with them. Send them a card. Do something to let them know they're not in this alone. Well, when we're talking about loss, a loss just doesn't have to be a death. A loss can be the death of somebody very close, a parent, grandparent, a friend, a spouse, a pet, aunts, uncles, friends, doesn't matter. A death of anybody is a loss. Now, another loss is a job. Let's say that a person has worked at a place for 20 years. Let's even make it 27 years. And all of a sudden, that business goes up and bankrupts. Wow. All of their financial security present and in the future is gone. That's going to be devastating. Or if they get fired, that's going to be devastating. What if they retire? Not only have they lost their job and the amount of income that was coming in, but they also have lost their routine and they've lost contact with the people that they have been working with for so long. If they have a loss of finances, this can cause a grieving situation. I personally think anybody who takes bankruptcy ought to be required to go to counseling, because that is a grieving situation and they could use some help. Now, health. If a person has surgery, there is a loss there. There's a loss of part of them. Let's say that they've been told they have an illness, or worse, a terminal illness. There's a loss of health and the idea of immortality. Whenever there is a loss of a relationship, this is a grieving situation. It doesn't have to be just a divorce. It can be, let's say a person has a friend, all 12 years of their schooling, they even went to college together, and now when they graduate, one gets a job across the country. And they've never ever had this kind of distance before, and all of a sudden they're not in close proximity anymore. What about if they've been friends all through grade school, junior high, high school, college, and something happens and their friendship ends? That too is a grieving situation. Also, breakups, romantic relationship, breaking up. That's a grieving situation. And I've had patients or clients come in and they say, "Well, I'm getting a divorce," and I said, "Well, we might need to talk about grief therapy." Grief therapy, I'm celebrating. I'm telling you, at some point, whether they've already done it or not, there's going to be some time of grieving. Other types of losses, a loss of innocence. When I work with sexual abuse clients, one of the things that I talk to them about is grieving their loss of innocence and their loss of youth, their loss of trust. There's a tremendous amount of things that we need to talk about that are losses. When I reached my 40th birthday, I had a friend of mine come up to me, and he put his arms around me and he drew me very, very close, and he whispered in my ear very softly and tenderly, "I guess you don't have to worry about dying young anymore, do you?" Oh, wow. I'm telling you, it was like somebody hit me with a baseball bat. All of a sudden I knew, wait a minute, somewhere along the way I lost my youth. And that hit me. And, my brain was telling me, hey, you're still 27. And all of a sudden, my body and even my friend was saying, you're a liar. And so that was a grieving situation. A loss of dreams, a loss of goals, a loss of security, a loss of identity. All these are grieving situations. Now, I have drugs on here. When a person is a drug addict, they have a 24/7, 365 relationship with that drug. And even though they are trying to eliminate it out of their life, they are trying to recover from that, it is a loss. And counselors ought to encourage anybody who is in recovery and trying to move forward from addiction. They need definitely to go through grief therapy. Other losses, spiritual loss. What if a church splits? What if a person undergoes such an event in their life that they start questioning spirituality and the things that they have held on to all their life spiritually, their concept of God? Other losses, a loss of self-esteem, a loss of childhood, a loss of independence. My mother once told me the hardest thing that she ever endured as far as aging was when she was told she couldn't drive a car anymore. And that was a grief situation for her. A loss of trust, a loss of ideals. all these things are losses and more. Well, there is a lady that is named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she did a tremendous amount of study on grief and dying, death and dying. And so she came up with 5 stages of dying, but it's also been found that people who are grieving goes through those 5 stages. I have found that in addition to these 5 stages, that there are 2 others that should be added. Okay? Well, let's talk about these stages. Now, before I tell you about these stages, I'm going to try and explain how these stages occur through a grieving episode in my life. Okay? That's the best way I can kind of explain how it happens. When I was growing up, we never ever really had a major grieving that our family went through. The closest was when I was about, I guess, 3 years old, and my great uncle died, and we went to his funeral, and I was told that he was sleeping, and that I wasn't quite understanding what that meant. And let me tell you, that may not be a real good way to explain grief, because that can upset a child and make them not want to go to sleep if they get scared about the way that's been explained. So anyway, I went through my grade school years not really knowing much about grieving, and then when I was in my junior high years, one day we were at school, and over the intercom they said that President John Kennedy was assassinated, and they sent us home. You have no idea what life was like then. We only had 3 channels on TV. They came on at 6 o'clock in the morning, went off at 12 at night. And when President Kennedy was assassinated, they went on 24/7 coverage. And a lot of that coverage was just cameras on his casket in the rotunda of the Capitol, and watching people pass by giving their respects. That was of such interest to me, and I was glued to the television. And at one point, when they were transferring the casket to another area, they had a picture where the casket went by Mrs. Kennedy and the 2 children, and little John, he saluted the casket that contained his father. And at another time it showed Jackie going in and looking at the casket and kissing the flag that draped it. And the television commentators were talking about how strong she was. What a wonderful, wonderful example she was of grieving. How strong she held up. What an incredible model she was for our country. Well, that's what I had as a image of how we were supposed to grieve. That's the only time I'd ever been taught anything about grieving. Well, many years later, when I was in college, I decided to come home and see the parents one day. And I came home late that night, and the next morning, a friend of mine called and woke me up, and she said, "Did you know that there is a James Bond film festival over at the theater. And I said, no, I didn't know. And now, you got to know, I am a James Bond fanatic. I mean, I own all of the first James Bond movies, probably all the way up through Roger Moore. But without a doubt, the only James Bond that I really, really consider James Bond is Sean Connery. And these were all of Sean Connery's movies. Well, we couldn't resist, and so we went and we spent all day watching Sean Connery being James Bond. I came home that night in the early evening, and I walked in, and, you know, my father was a physician, and he loved his patients so much, he didn't want them to have to go to the emergency room, so he kept his office open 6 days a week. And so here it was Saturday, and here it was in the early evening, and I walked in, and I said, well, Mom, where's Dad? And she said, well, he hadn't made it home from the office yet. And so she was cooking pepper steak, and we were sitting there talking when there was a knock on the door. And I went to the door, and there was a uniformed officer. And he said, is this the residence of Dr. Paul Wright? And I said, yes, it is. And he said, Dr. Wright has collapsed at Walmart. It's very, very serious. He's in the emergency room. They say you need to be there immediately. Well, this brings us to the first step that Kubler-Ross said is the step of grieving. The first stage of grieving is denial. Okay? Denial, you can feel devastated, stunned, shocked, numb, disbelief. You don't want to accept it. And the first words, you know, as soon as we walked into the emergency room, a doctor was coming out of the exam room, and he looked at us, and his eyes lowered real quick, and I knew something was coming. And he walked over to us, and he said, I'm so sorry. Dr. Wright didn't make it. And my first words were, are you sure it's Dr. Paul Wright? I mean, you know, we've got a lot of Dr. Wrights here. And he said, Dr. Paul is a friend of mine. I know Dr. Paul well. And he said, I'm so sorry. He said, Dr. Paul didn't make it. Well, as you can tell from the first words that I uttered, I was stunned, and I didn't want to accept it, didn't want to believe it. And I was in shock, and I was numb for the coming days. Well, now, before I go any further, as we go through these stages, you don't have to go through them sequentially. Many people do. But you do have to go through every stage to resolve the anger. To resolve the grief, okay? So the next stage is what's called anger. Now, the way you know that a person's in the anger stage, they can actually be outwardly mad, outwardly angry. They can appear hostile or irritable. They will be having thoughts of revenge or vengeance. They might have insomnia, feel restless, or even anxious. Now with me, actually, I settled down into anger against 3 targets. The first target was myself. I said, how in the world could you go throughout your life and not know your daddy any more than you do? And how could you let these issues that affect you, how could you let them go without talking to your dad about them and resolving them? And so there were several things that were going through my mind, and I was hurting. Well, I was also mad at Dad. You know, I said, Dad, you were a doctor. How could you have gone through day-to-day living and know that you were having these problems and not do something to get some help. I was mad. I felt betrayed because I felt like he just really, he could have done something and he didn't. And I was mad because, he was very much of a tyrant and he wouldn't let me talk to him. And, he was very emotionally distant and very emotionally abusive. And so I was never as close to him as many people are to their parents. I was also very angry at God. I went through a real spiritual crisis. And, I said, God, how in the world could you let him die when he hasn't seen that I could be worth something? See, my father never let me feel like I was worth anything. And how could you let him die before you let him see that I got married? How could you let him die before he saw me graduate college and start out on a career and let him know that, I was succeeding in life? How could you let him die and not let him experience some of these milestones that everybody looks forward to? Well, I kept that anger for a long time. Well, the next stage is what's called bargaining. Now, bargaining is a manipulative stage. And a lot of the times, you will know that you're in the bargaining stage because of if-only statements. My if-only statement, if only I hadn't gone to the show, I might have been at the office to help Dad. And since I was in paramedic training, I might have been able to do something to save his life and at least give him enough time to get to the hospital and give him more of a break. Or how about, oh God, if only you would make this a bad dream and I wake up and it's not true. God, I promise, I'll do anything for you. I'll go to church every Sunday. I'll be there Sunday morning, Sunday night. I'll tithe more. I'll study more. I'll pray more. I'll be there Wednesday night. If only you will do this, I promise I will do that. Drug addicts, they're big into bargaining. Sweetheart, if only you'll come back, I promise I'll never ever drink again. Okay? So, interestingly, I held on to that for many years. If only I had been there, maybe I could have helped. Well, you know something? Many, many years later, and I can't tell you now how it happened, but I found out who was standing next to my dad when he collapsed at Walmart. And furthermore, I actually had a chance to be at a occasion where she was there, and I was able to meet her and talk with her. And after getting to know her a little bit, I said, I hate to impose on you, but I said, you were there when my father passed away. And I said, I really, I don't know anything about what happened. And would you mind telling me what went on when Dad died? And she said, well, I'm a cardiac ICU nurse, and I knew exactly when the way he screamed and the way he went down, what was going on. And she said, I immediately started CPR. And she goes, I did everything I possibly knew to do to help your dad. And the second I heard that, I knew it wouldn't have mattered if I had been there or not. And I guess my Lord knew I needed to hear that so I could get past this stage. And so, yes, The first stage is denial. The second stage is bargaining. The second stage is anger. Third stage, bargaining. Now, Kubler-Ross says the fourth stage is depression. And I'll go with that. The fourth stage is a stage where a person can feel really, really helpless and hopeless. They can feel very, very emotionally locked up. They can feel they're in an emotional logjam, and they might not be able to make decisions, might not be able to function, that they're just really, really in a bad place. Well, this is a very, very bad place to be. I call it actually the pit. And when you go into the pit, some people will go in and they'll find it's so painful they can't stay there, and they'll come back out, and they'll either camp in denial, anger, or bargaining. Some people will come into the pit and it's so painful they have to run out of it, and they'll try and anesthetize their pain by drinking or drugging. Then you have some people that if they don't leave the pit, if they just stay in the pit, they can become suicidal. So the key is to walk through the pit, to get through the pit, not to return to the side of the denial, anger, or bargaining, but to move through it into what I call the sad or blue stage. Now, the way that you can get through the pit, normally you have to have somebody you trust, and they will let you talk about your feelings, your thoughts, your emotions, your memories, your responses, your whatever is in you that needs to come out. And it has to be somebody you trust, somebody that you know that's not going to hurt you with the things that you say, because you're going to be pretty vulnerable at that time and later because of the things that come out. Sometimes the people that help you through the pit are therapists. Sometimes it's just your best friend. Sometimes it's a teacher. Sometimes it's a minister. Sometimes it's a spouse. Sometimes it's a sibling. Sometimes it's some form of relative. It might be a AA sponsor. It doesn't matter who it is, as long as they're trustworthy, and they'll never ever abuse that trust by listening to some of your most vulnerable and inner thoughts and feelings. Well, when you start moving out of the pit, you'll move into an area that I call sad and blue, because this isn't one of Kubler-Ross's stages. This is kind of what I've come up with, because the people that I know that are moving through a major grief episode, they will come out and they'll say, I know I'm not there yet, but I know I'm getting better, because instead of just feeling so low and so depressed, I'm feeling kind of sad and blue, but I'm seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. Well, after they get through and move through the sad and blue stage, then there's the stage of acceptance. Here, the person will accept the reality of the situation. They know the person is gone. They've come to grips with their emotions, with their thoughts. They're dealing honestly now with their emotions and their feelings. And they're starting to live in the present and not in the past. They're looking to the future. By not living in the past, it's not, constantly thinking about that the person who's lost. Not thinking about the pain, not living in the pain, not what would they have me do, or what would I be doing if they were here now. They're living in the present, and they're starting to look to the future. Where they've been isolating, now they may be starting to seek their relationships again and establish new relationships. They have a new sense of hope instead of being hopeless. And instead of having intrusive thoughts of pain and memories that are painful, they're starting to control their thought life, and they're starting to have more positive thoughts. Well, what was this like for me? I knew that real healing came to me when I went to my father's grave. I had not been to my father's grave in years and years and years since his funeral. And I went to my father's grave and I sat down on it and I said, Dad, you never would listen to me in the past, but you hadn't got a choice now. And so I started talking to him about things that I had always wanted to say to him. I talked to him about things I was angry about, things that I was sad about. Talked to him about things that he had missed that I wish that he had been there for. I laughed, I cried. I said, Dad, the proudest moment I ever had when you were my father was when I got into that wasp's nest and Mom called you and you shut down your practice that day and you came home and you tended to every one of those stings. And then when I got to feeling better, you put me right in a window and you said, I want you to watch something. And you went outside and you soaked the nest in bug spray. And then, after you did that, you knocked the nest down and you soaked it in lighter fluid. Then you lit the nest, and as it went and flamed, when it was almost going out, you started stomping the nest. And then you came back in and you said, nothing's ever going to hurt my princess again. And Dad, I've never been prouder and never felt more loved by you in my life. And Dad, the time that probably hurt me the most was when I was 3 years old. I wanted to crawl up in your lap, and you took me and you set me down, and you said, Daddy doesn't like you in his lap because he doesn't like to feel crowded. Well, a little 3-year-old doesn't understand that. And those are the kind of things that I talked to my dad about, and things I got angry about, and things that I loved and smiled and laughed and was thankful for the memory. And so after about 2 hours, I got up and I felt a tremendous amount of healing had occurred. Well, Kubler-Ross said this is the end stage of grieving. But honestly, I believe that there's one more stage that has to be done to completely resolve grief, and that's forgiveness. Now, forgiveness is not forgetting and just saying, okay, it never happened. You can't do that. Forgiving is not approving of the person's action, and it's not saying, okay, it's okay, don't just forget it. That's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is actually turning a situation in which you have been wronged over to the legal system or to your higher power, or both. A lot of times when I'm counseling, especially somebody who's been sexually abused, we'll have gone through the grieving model, and then we get to the forgiveness, and I said, have you forgiven your abuser? I can't do that. I can't do that. And I say, well, that's your choice, but as long as you don't forgive them, they're going to have power over you. You're going to give them free rent in your head, and you will never ever be completely free of that person. To not forgive is very much like drinking poison so the other person will die. It's like having a casserole, a tuna casserole in your refrigerator and pushing it to the back of the refrigerator for 6 months and then looking at it and wondering, I wonder, it's there. Well, when you open up that thing of tuna, not only is it not safe, it's poisonous. And that's what a lack of forgiveness is. It's poisonous, but it's poisonous to you. It'll do incredible damage. It'll cause you all kind of physical problems. It can cause all kind of mental problems. It can cause psychological problems. But it is a choice. And to choose not to forgive is to choose to allow that person to keep not only power over you, but dogging you constantly. Well, when there's somebody that that has had a grief situation, here's some things not to do. Don't feel that way. Don't cry. They need to cry. They need to let their emotions out. In fact, when I'm counseling, I tell them, please cry, because I know every tear tells me how much you love that person. Don't say to be brave, and don't tell them to get over it. Don't tell them it's time to move on, and don't tell them to suck it up, get a life. Don't say, life goes on. And don't say, well, I know that they're happier now in a better place. A lady I worked with lost her best friend because of that. She had a child that was not supposed to live past 9 and lived until he was 20. And her friend came up and said, well, he's in a better place now and you can feel good. And she was so offended because she said, I spent my life trying to make this place the best place on earth, the best he could have. And she said, I loved every day that I was with him. And to imply that I wasn't happy or that he didn't have a good place here, she goes, I'm terribly offended. And she was hurt, and she ended the friendship. Don't say at least he's not suffering now. And don't tell him that the children need you to be strong. They might need you to model it's okay to feel emotions. And the last one here, I'm kind of glad it's not showing because I didn't want you to jump ahead of me. When my mother passed away, I had a friend come up to me and he said, I heard that your mother passed away. And I said, yes. And he said, oh, I'm very, very sorry. I said, well, thank you. I appreciate that. And he said, I just want to welcome you to the Orphans Club. Because he knew my dad was already dead. And for him to say, I want to welcome you to the Orphans Club, I wanted to smack him. I don't know if I've ever heard anything so insensitive in my life. And that's, a lot of nice things were said at the time. I'm not sure that one didn't stick out more than anything. And it's sad, but it's true, that I remember that one more than anything else that was said. But that was probably the worst thing I've ever heard said to a person who's grieving. If you tell them you understand, they're probably going to say, no, you don't. And you may have gone through grieving. You may have gone through a similar thing, but you probably don't understand 100% of what they're feeling. And please don't tell them that they must be strong and strong for the children and that you have to move on. Please don't tell them, get a hold of yourself. And please don't tell them others have it worse than you. They're hurting. They're hurting, and they're hurting bad. And so hopefully you will know that they don't need for you to tell them that, or to invalidate what they're feeling. Well, what can you do? Oh, okay, other things not to do. Don't try to minimize their pain. Don't try to explain what God's doing behind the scenes, and don't compare what the person is going through to anything or anyone else's problem. Don't use cliches and platitudes such as empty words or statements. Don't instruct the person on what to do, what to feel. And don't forget to check on the person in a week or two and then in 12 months. Now, things that can be helpful to say. I'm so sorry to hear about your loss. I can't imagine what you're going through. I don't know what to say, but I'll be glad to listen. How are you really feeling? What can I do to help? Now, you have to be careful with those two things because it may be too early, or they may think that you're trying to pry or get too much into their stuff at the time. So you have to be careful with those. Things that you can do, give them a hug. I'd probably ask, but give them a hug because sometimes a hug is worth more than 10,000 words. Send them a card. I grieve with you. Pray. If you're a praying person, pray. If you are a praying person, it's the most powerful thing that you can say or do. And remember to pay a visit to the person who experienced a loss during the weeks that are coming. Characteristics of unresolved grief. As I've been talking, if you have had emotions well up and you found that there are tears in your eyes or your ideas are kind of ruminating back and thinking about something and you become sad, that's probably an indication that the grief hadn't been completely resolved. Having a reaction that lingers on and on. I had one lady come in and she came in crying very hard, and I asked her why she was there, and she said, well, my husband died. And I said, I'm so sorry. I said, when did this happen? And she said, 5 years ago. Well, that's a distortion of a reaction. That's far too long, and especially for her to be sobbing like she was. A distortion of a normal grief reaction is an indication. Now, when I say an absence of a normal grief reaction, you have to be careful with that because some people are just so stunned they can't feel anything. Another may have had what's called ongoing grief, where they have seen a person that's going through a terminal or a prolonged death, and they've been going through these stages throughout that ordeal. And so by the time that they get the person passes, then they have already resolved so much, so they're functioning already in a resolved way. Our country does not teach us how to grieve. Our culture does not teach us how to grieve. There are many cultures that they have traditions, they have rituals, and it helps them to grieve, helps them to get through the grief. But our country doesn't do that, and we should. And so I hope that this lecture has helped in some way. I hope that this lecture has enlightened you. I hope that you can use it in some way that can be beneficial to you or somebody that you know. And with that said, we'll wrap up this lecture, and have a great day, have a great week, and God bless.